In the affluent suburbs of Northwood, 72-year-old Audrey Thompson, a woman whose grace and composure were as well known as her prize-winning rose garden, was about to discover the true price of her late husband's legacy. What should have been a quiet period of remembrance for her beloved Richard turned into a bitter war when his children, blinded by greed, confronted her with a demand that shattered the fragile peace of her grief. Audrey, who had spent 2 decades navigating the complex currents of her blended family, had always met their veiled hostility with unwavering kindness. But when their resentment finally erupted into a monstrous sense of entitlement, she had no idea they were about to learn the most devastating lesson of their lives: that a parent's love is a gift, not a debt to be collected. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The silence in the grand colonial house on Maple Drive was a heavy, suffocating blanket. It had been 3 weeks since Richard Thompson's heart, a powerful engine that had driven a financial empire and a sprawling, complicated family, had quietly given its last beat. For Audrey, his wife of 20 years, the silence was a constant, aching reminder of the vibrant life that had been extinguished. Every room, every polished surface, every shadow in the corner held an echo of him. His booming laugh, the scent of his pipe tobacco, the weight of his hand on her shoulder, it all lingered, a ghostly presence in a home that now felt more like a museum of their shared life than a place to live. This evening the silence was different. It was not the quiet of grief, but the tense, charged stillness before a storm. Richard's children were here. Leo, the eldest at 48, sat in his father's favorite wingback chair as if testing it for size. He possessed Richard's ambition, but none of his warmth, his sharp suit and sharper gaze, assessing every object in the room as if it were already an asset on a balance sheet. Beside him, his wife, Fiona, a woman whose face was a mask of practiced sympathy, clutched a designer handbag like a shield. Chloe, 45, perched on the edge of the sofa, her posture a study in barely concealed impatience. A lifestyle blogger with a significant online following, she had built a brand on a carefully curated image of effortless elegance and familial bliss, an image that was currently being threatened by the inconvenient reality of her father's death. Her husband, Mark, a man whose gaze drifted constantly to his phone, sat beside her, his disinterest a palpable force in the room. And then there was Sam, the youngest at 42. He stood by the window, his shoulders hunched, his gaze fixed on the darkening lawn outside. A high school history teacher, Sam had always been the quiet observer in the family, his gentle nature often mistaken for weakness. He was the one who remembered Audrey's birthday, the one who asked about her day, the one whose eyes held a flicker of shame at his sibling's behavior. But that flicker had never yet ignited into a fire of defiance. Audrey had called them here tonight, hoping to discuss the future, to find some common ground in their shared loss. She had prepared coffee and a platter of pastries from the bakery Richard had loved, small gestures of peace in a war she had never wanted to fight. But the pastries sat untouched, the coffee growing cold. It was Leo who finally broke the silence, his voice devoid of any emotions save for a chilling pragmatism. "Audrey," he began, the name sounding foreign and sterile on his lips. "We need to talk about the estate." Audrey's hands tightened in her lap. She had expected this, of course, but not so soon, not with such brutal directness. "Leo, your father's will is with the attorney. Everything will be handled in due course. I thought tonight we could just remember him." A short, humorless laugh escaped Chloe's lips. "Remember him? Dad wouldn't want us to sit around being sentimental while his life's work hangs in the balance. He was a businessman. He would expect us to be practical." She gestured vaguely around the room, a sweep of her hand that encompassed the antique furniture, the valuable paintings, the very air of wealth that permeated the house. "This all represents decades of his hard work, our hard work, in a way. We sacrificed too." Audrey blinked, trying to process the stunning audacity of the statement. Sacrificed? Leo had been given a seven-figure sum to start his own venture capital firm, a firm that now floundered due to his reckless investments. Chloe had received a fully funded trust that financed her lavish lifestyle and sponsored posts about authentic living. Sam was the only one who had forged his own path, choosing a life of modest means and quiet purpose. "We think," Leo continued, taking his cue from Chloe's volley, "that there needs to be an interim distribution of assets to tide us over until the probate process is complete." This was it, the reason for their funereal visit. Not to grieve, not to comfort, but to collect. "Tide you over?" Audrey's voice was barely a whisper. "Leo, your father was incredibly generous with all of you throughout his life." "Generosity is one thing," Leo said, his voice hardening. "What we are owed is another. Dad always told us that this was a family legacy, that everything he built was for us, for his children. He owed us that." The words hung in the air, venomous and cold. He owed us. The sentiment was so foreign to everything Audrey knew of Richard's philosophy. He believed in earning, in creating, in giving, but not in indebting. He saw his wealth as a tool for opportunity, not a birthright. Audrey looked from Leo's stony face to Chloe's self-righteous pout, and finally to Sam, who was now staring at his shoes, the conflict written in the tense line of his shoulders. She felt a profound and weary sadness settle over her. She had spent 20 years loving these people, or at least trying to. She had hosted their birthdays, celebrated their promotions, and held their hands through their divorces. She had been the steady, constant presence in their lives after their own mother had passed away, a woman she had never met but whose memory she had always respected. She had stepped carefully, patiently, hoping that time and kindness would eventually weave her into the fabric of their family. Momerel. She had been a fool. To them, she was not family. She was an obstacle, an impediment to their inheritance. "My kids are screaming at me," Chloe said, her voice rising with practiced drama, as if she were reciting a script for one of her online videos. "They're asking why they can't go on the ski trip to Aspen this year. They're asking why we have to quote, tighten our belts. I have to explain to them that their grandfather's money, the money that should be theirs, is tied up." "You owe us, Audrey," Leo stated, his voice flat and final. "You lived in his house. You spent his money. You enjoyed the fruits of his labor for 20 years. Now it's our turn. You owe us a significant advance on our inheritance. Let's call it a down payment on what's rightfully ours." A fire began to smolder in Audrey's chest, a feeling she had suppressed for 2 decades. It was the fire of righteous anger. She had not simply spent his money. She had been his partner in every sense of the word. She had managed their homes, organized their social lives, and supported his ambitions. She had been the one to sit with him through long nights when a deal went south, the one who nursed him through illnesses, the one whose love had, by his own admission, given him a second chance at happiness. They had built this life together. She rose from her chair, her movements slow and deliberate. The woman who had entered this room hoping for connection was gone, replaced by someone they had never seen before. "I owe you nothing," she said, her voice quiet but ringing with a newfound strength that made Leo and Chloe flinch. "Your father owed you nothing. He gave you everything. He gave you love, he gave you support, he gave you every opportunity to build your own lives. If you have squandered those opportunities, that is a failure of your own making, not a debt to be collected from his estate." She looked directly at Leo. "Your father worried constantly about your business, about the risks you were taking with money he gave you. He hoped you would learn the value of prudence." She turned her gaze to Chloe. "And he was deeply saddened by your obsession with appearances, by the way you valued the image of a happy family more than the work it takes to actually be one." Finally she looked at Sam, and her voice softened with a flicker of the love she still felt for him, the lost boy who had never found his footing. "And he was proud of you, Sam. Proud that you chose your own path. But he worried that you allowed your siblings to silence your conscience." A choked sound escaped Sam's throat, and he turned his face further into the shadows. "The will," Audrey said, addressing all of them, "will be read in due time. Until then, this conversation is over. I think it's time for you to leave my house." The shock on their faces was almost comical. They had come expecting a negotiation, expecting her to be the same pliable, accommodating stepmother they had always known. They had not expected a queen defending her castle. Leo was the first to recover, his face contorting with rage. "Your house? This is our father's house." "You are living on borrowed time, Audrey. When that will is read, you will see what you are really owed. Nothing." He stormed out of the house, Fiona scrambling to keep up with him. Chloe, after giving Audrey a look of pure venom, followed suit, her husband trailing behind her like a shadow. Only Sam remained. He turned from the window, his face a mess of conflicting emotions. "Audrey, he began, his voice cracking. "I'm sorry." The apology was a balm on a raw wound, but it was not enough. Not anymore. "Sorry for what, Sam?" Audrey asked, her voice laced with a weariness that went bone deep. "Sorry for what they said? Or sorry that you sat there and said nothing?" Sam had no answer. He looked at the floor, then at the door, then back at her, his eyes pleading for an understanding she was no longer willing to give. With a final, defeated sigh, he too walked out, leaving Audrey alone in the suffocating silence of the grand house. She stood for a long time in the center of the room, the untouched pastries a bitter testament to her failed hopes. The grief for her husband was still a raw, open wound, but now a new feeling was taking root beside it. A cold, hard resolve. They had drawn their line in the sand. They had demanded what they believed they were owed. And Audrey, in the crushing solitude of her empty home, began to wonder what Richard, the man who had seen their flaws so clearly, had truly believed they deserved. She had a feeling they were about to find out. The days that followed the disastrous family meeting bled into one another in a haze of grief and a growing, unfamiliar anger. The grand house on Maple Drive, once a sanctuary of shared love and quiet companionship, now felt like a gilded cage. Every object, every piece of art Richard had lovingly collected, seemed to mock Audrey with the memory of her stepchildren's avarice. Leo's chilling pronouncement, "You owe us," echoed in the silent halls, a poison seeping into the foundations of the life she and Richard had built. Audrey moved through her days on autopilot, answering condolence calls with practiced grace, sorting through Richard's papers with a numb efficiency. But underneath the placid surface, a storm was brewing. The compliant, peacekeeping woman she had been for 20 years was slowly being replaced by someone else, someone forged in the fire of betrayal. It was on a particularly bleak Tuesday afternoon that the doorbell chimed, pulling Audrey from a reverie of sorting through Richard's old photographs. On the doorstep stood Clara Maxwell, her best friend of 30 years, her arms laden with a casserole dish and a bottle of wine, her face a mask of determined concern. Clara was the antithesis of Lansing's polished society wives. A retired journalist with a razor-sharp wit and a bullshit detector to match, she had been Audrey's anchor through every storm life had thrown at her. "Don't you dare tell me you're fine," Clara said, bustling past Audrey into the kitchen with the force of a friendly hurricane. "I got the distinct impression from our last phone call that fine was several zip codes away from your current location. I've brought lasagna and a Cabernet that's been known to solve international disputes. Now, talk." The simple, no-nonsense command was exactly what Audrey needed. The dam of her composure, so carefully maintained for weeks, finally broke. Sinking into a kitchen chair, she recounted the entire sordid evening. The coldness of Leo and Chloe, their shocking demand for money, and the cruel, dismissive way they had spoken of their father's legacy. Clara listened, her expression growing stormier with each word. When Audrey finished, her voice cracking as she repeated Leo's final, cutting remark, Clara slammed the casserole dish down on the granite countertop with a thud that made the crystal wine glasses tremble. "Bastards," she said, her voice a low growl. "The absolute, unmitigated bastards. You owe us?" The only thing Richard owed them was a good slap for their monumental ingratitude. She softened her tone as she saw the tears welling in Audrey's eyes. "Oh, honey, I'm so sorry. I know you tried so hard with them, for so long." The validation was a lifeline. For days, Audrey had been questioning herself, wondering if she had misjudged them, if her grief was distorting her perception. But Clara, in her brutally honest way, saw it for what it was, a calculated, greedy attack. "What gets me, Clara," Audrey said, wiping a tear from her cheek, "is how they twisted his memory. Richard was the most generous man I've ever known. He set them all up for life. He paid for their educations, their homes, their businesses, and for them to stand in his house and claim he owed them, it felt like a desecration." "They're not just greedy, Audrey. They're delusional," Clara said, expertly uncorking the wine. "They've lived in the bubble of Richard's wealth for so long, they think it's the air they're meant to breathe. They never had to earn it, so they have no concept of its value or of the man who worked his entire life to create it." She poured 2 generous glasses and slid one across the counter to Audrey. "Richard saw it, you know. Don't think for a second he was blind to it." Audrey took a sip of wine, its warmth a small comfort. "He did. He would make excuses for them, of course. Leo's under a lot of pressure. Chloe just wants to feel secure, but I could see the disappointment in his eyes. After every holiday, after every family dinner, there was this sadness, this quiet resignation. A memory surfaced, sharp and painful. Richard's 70th birthday party, just last year. Audrey had spent months planning it, a grand affair to celebrate the man she adored. She had coordinated everything, from the caterers to the string quartet. But on the night of the party, Leo and Chloe had effectively hijacked the celebration. They had monopolized their father, steering him toward their own circles of friends and business associates, leaving Audrey to manage the logistics, an organizer rather than the co-host and wife of the guest of honor. They had made toast after toast to the great Richard Thompson, the patriarch, the visionary, the founder of a dynasty, with barely a mention of the woman who had been his partner and his joy for the last 2 decades. Richard had been furious, but quietly so. He'd found her later that night in their library, her smile strained. "They don't see you, do they, AUD?" he had murmured, his voice thick with a pain he rarely showed. "They look right at you, and they don't see the woman who saved my life." "He saw more than you think," Clara insisted, her journalist's instincts kicking in. "Richard was a brilliant man. He built an empire by reading people, by anticipating their moves. Do you really think he wouldn't have a contingency plan for his own children's avarice?" The question hung in the air. A contingency plan. Audrey had been so consumed by her grief and their betrayal that she hadn't considered it. She had assumed Richard's will would be what it had always been. A straightforward, generous distribution of his assets among his children, with a comfortable provision for her. Later that night after the party, Audrey said slowly, the memory solidifying, "He was in his study for hours. I thought he was just decompressing. He was writing in that old leather-bound journal of his, the one he always kept." "His journal?" Clara's eyes lit up. "Where is it?" I'm not sure, probably in his study. I haven't been able to bring myself to go through his personal desk yet." "Well," Clara said, draining her wine glass and setting it down with a decisive click, "there's no time like the present. That's not just a journal, Audrey. That's a potential piece of evidence. It's Richard's voice, and right now, I think you need to hear it." Fueled by a mixture of wine and a dawning sense of purpose, Audrey led Clara to Richard's study. The room was Richard's sanctuary, smelling of old books, leather, and his lingering scent. The mahogany desk was just as he had left it, neat and organized, a testament to his orderly mind. For a moment, Audrey hesitated, feeling like a trespasser, but Clara's steadying hand on her shoulder gave her the courage she needed. She sat in his large leather chair, the worn leather still holding the impression of his body. With a deep breath, she began to open the drawers. The top ones held stationery, pens, and business files. The bottom right drawer, however, was locked. Of course, Clara muttered. The man had secrets. I think I know where the key is, Audrey said, a memory sparking. Richard had always worn a small, antique silver key on his watch chain, a key she had always teased him about, calling it the key to his heart. He'd always just smiled mysteriously. She went to their bedroom and opened the velvet-lined box on his dresser, where she'd placed his personal effects from the hospital. There, coiled at the bottom, was his gold watch, the small silver key still attached. Her fingers trembled as she picked it up. Back in the study, she inserted the key into the lock. It turned with a satisfying click. With a deep breath, Audrey pulled the drawer open. Inside, nestled among old stock certificates and property deeds, was a handsome, well-worn leather journal. Its cover was soft from years of use. It felt warm to the touch, as if it still held the heat of Richard's hands. Beside it, however, was something else, something that made Audrey's breath catch in her throat. A thick, sealed manila envelope with a single word written on the front in Richard's bold, familiar script. Audrey. What is it? Clara whispered, leaning in. Audrey picked up the envelope. It was heavy, substantial. Her name, written in his hand, was both a comfort and a mystery. What had he written to her that needed to be sealed and locked away? Maybe you should read the journal first, Clara suggested gently. For context. Nodding, Audrey set the envelope aside and opened the journal. The pages were filled with Richard's precise, elegant handwriting. The entries were mostly business notes, market observations, and random thoughts. But, as she flipped toward the back, to the entries from the last year of his life, the tone began to change. The entries became more personal, more reflective, and, as Audrey would soon discover, more damning. The last entry was dated the night of his 70th birthday party. Her heart pounded as she began to read. October 15th. A grand party to celebrate 7 decades. Audrey, my brilliant Audrey, outdid herself. The house looked magnificent. The food was superb. The company, predictable. My children, my legacy. Leo, holding court, talking about leveraged buyouts as if he invented the concept. All on my dime. Chloe, flitting from group to group, a butterfly collecting compliments, her smile never quite reaching her eyes. And Sam, my quiet Sam, watching from the wings, his heart at war with his loyalties. They toasted me tonight. They toasted my success. But they did not see the architect of my happiness standing beside me. They see Audrey as the curator of my life, not the co-creator. After the guests left, they came to me in this study. The same conversation, different year. Dad, we need to talk about the future. Dad, the market is volatile. Dad, we need to secure our position. It was never how are you or are you happy. It was always about the money. Tonight they used a new phrase, one that chilled me to the bone. Chloe, in a moment of stunning audacity, said that my primary responsibility was to quote, protect their inheritance. Not to be happy. Not to live my life. But to protect what they believe is theirs. They don't see this as a gift. They see it as a debt I owe them for being born. This changes things. This changes everything. I spoke to Robert Miller this morning. It is time to draw up a new will. A final testament. Not just of my assets, but of my values. They are about to learn the true meaning of the word legacy. And it is not what they think. Audrey read the entry again, and then a third time, the words blurring through a fresh wave of tears. But these were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of profound, soul-shaking validation. He had seen it. He had seen it all. The slights she had absorbed, the exclusions she had endured, the transactional nature of his children's affection. He hadn't just noticed it. He had been wounded by it, angered by it, and ultimately moved to action by it. Robert Miller, Richard's longtime attorney and friend. I spoke to Robert Miller this morning. It is time to draw up a new will. Bolino. Clara, who had been reading over her shoulder, let out a long, low whistle. Well, I'll be damned, she breathed. The old fox. He wasn't just sad, Audrey. He was building a case. A shiver went down Audrey's spine. The memory of Leo's sneering face, his confident assertion that she would get nothing, now seemed like the height of dramatic irony. While they had been plotting how to secure their inheritance, their father had been quietly planning to teach them a lesson that would reverberate through the rest of their lives. The weight of the sealed manila envelope on the desk suddenly felt immense. It was no longer just a letter. It was a verdict. With trembling hands, Audrey picked it up. The paper was thick, expensive. She could feel the documents inside. This wasn't just a letter. It was something formal, something official. "Open it," Clara urged, her voice tight with anticipation. Audrey broke the seal. Inside, she found not a letter, but a crisp, blue-backed legal document. The heading at the top sent a jolt through her. "Last Will and Testament of Richard A. Thompson." And beneath it, a cover letter from Robert Miller's law firm. "Dear Audrey, enclosed you will find a copy of Richard's final will, executed on October 20th of last year. He left this copy with me in a sealed envelope, with explicit instructions that it be delivered to you personally upon his death, prior to the official reading with the rest of the family. He was adamant that you be prepared. He also left a personal letter for you which you will find attached. He said, and I quote, 'She needs to know the why before she has to deal with the what.' Richard was a remarkable man, and he loved you very, very much. Please call me at your convenience to schedule a time to discuss the next steps. I suspect you will have questions. Yours sincerely, Robert Miller." Audrey's hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold the documents. A will. A new will. She unfolded the attached letter, the one written in Richard's hand. "My dearest Audrey, if you are reading this, it means I am gone, and the silence in our beautiful home is deafening. I am sorry for the pain you are feeling, my love. My only regret in a life full of blessings is leaving you to face the world, and more specifically, my children, alone. But I did not leave you unprotected. The document you are holding is my final word, my true testament. It is a reflection of the lessons I learned too late in life, and a tribute to the woman who taught them to me. For years, I watched my children. I watched them take your kindness for granted. I watched them treat you as a temporary fixture in my life, a placeholder they had to tolerate until they could claim what they believed was theirs. I made excuses for them. I told myself they were still grieving their mother. I told myself they were immature. I was wrong. They are not immature. They are ungrateful. They are not grieving. They are greedy. The night of my 70th birthday was the final, clarifying blow. When they stood in my study and spoke of my wealth not as a gift to be cherished, but as a debt I owed them, I saw the truth. I had raised them, provided for them, and given them every advantage, but I had failed to instill in them the one thing that truly matters: a grateful heart. You, my darling Audrey, have a heart full of grace. You came into my life and asked for nothing, yet you gave me everything. You rebuilt my world. You showed me what true partnership was. The happiness I found with you was the greatest success of my life, far greater than any business deal or stock market win. And so I have made a decision. A hard one, but a just one. My children believe they are owed my legacy. They are about to discover that you are my legacy. What I have left you is not a reward, my love. It is a recognition. It is the fortress I have built to protect you from their entitlement. It is the tool with which you can continue to do good in the world, as you have always done. Use it well. Live beautifully, do not let them burden you with their bitterness. Their choices have led them to this moment. Your grace has led you to yours. You were the best decision I ever made. Never doubt it. All my love, forever. Richard. Audrey's tears fell onto the page, blurring the ink of Richard's final, loving words. He hadn't just left her his money, he had left her his validation. He had left her his unequivocal, fierce, and final defense. He had armed her. "The will," Clara whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Audrey, what does the will say?" With a deep, steadying breath, Audrey turned to the formal document. She scanned the legal jargon, her eyes searching for the operative clauses. The bequests, the final distribution of the empire Richard had built. And then she found it. Article 4. Specific bequests. A. To my son, Leo Thompson, I leave my collection of antique maps and the sum of $100,000. $100,000. It is my fervent hope that this sum, while modest, will provide him with a fresh start, and that the maps will remind him that there is a wide world beyond the narrow confines of a balance sheet. B. To my daughter, Chloe Thompson Wells, I leave my late wife Eleanor's jewelry collection and the sum of $100,000. $100,000. It is my hope that the jewelry will remind her of a woman of true substance, and that the money will be enough to teach her the difference between what one needs and what one merely wants. C. To my son, Samuel Thompson, I leave my personal library of first edition history books and the sum of $100,000. $100,000. I hope these books, which he has always cherished, will remind him of the importance of learning from the past, and that the money will grant him the freedom to continue his noble work without financial strain. $100,000. Each. In an estate worth tens of millions. It was a statement. A deliberate, calculated, and devastating statement. Audrey's eyes scanned down the page, her heart pounding in her chest. Article 5, Residuary Estate. All the rest, residue and remainder of my estate, of every kind and nature, whether real, personal, or mixed, and wherever situated, I give, devise, and bequeath to my beloved wife, Audrey Thompson, absolutely and in fee simple. The words seemed to lift off the page. The remainder of my estate, the house, the investment portfolio, the art collection, the controlling interest in Thompson Financial, everything. Clara let out a gasp. He did it. The absolute madman, he actually did it. He left you everything. Audrey leaned back in Richard's chair, the leather creaking under her weight. The air in the room felt different, lighter. The ghosts of Leo's and Chloe's greedy demands were being exorcised by the power of Richard's final, decisive act. She was not the grieving widow, the inconvenient stepmother, the obstacle to be overcome. She was the heir. A slow smile spread across her face, the first genuine smile in weeks. It was not a smile of triumph or greed. It was a smile of pure, unadulterated love for the man who had seen her, valued her, and, even from beyond the grave, had risen to her defense. They wanted what they were owed, Audrey said softly, looking at Clara, and Richard made sure they got it. The conference room at Miller & Associates was a study in beige and muted tones, a deliberately neutral space designed to absorb the emotional shockwaves that so often accompanied the reading of a last will and testament. But no amount of beige could temper the atmosphere of raw, crackling tension that filled the room on this Thursday morning. It felt like a courtroom, a stage, and a funeral home all rolled into one. Audrey sat at one end of the long, polished mahogany table, a portrait of serene composure. She had chosen her attire with care, a simple, elegant navy blue dress paired with the pearl necklace Richard had given her on their 10th anniversary. It was an outfit that projected quiet authority, not apology. Beside her, Clara Maxwell sat as a silent observer, her presence a solid, grounding force. Clara's role was unofficial, but clear. She was there as Audrey's witness, her shield, her friend. At the opposite end of the table, the Thompson children were assembled like a hostile delegation. Leo, flanked by a pugnacious-looking lawyer who seemed to be surgically attached to his smartphone, radiated an aura of impatient entitlement. He had come not to hear his father's last wishes, but to confirm his own expectations. He had already, in his mind, begun restructuring Thompson Financial, ousting the old guard, and rebranding the firm in his own image. Chloe sat beside him, her face arranged in an expression of somber grace she had likely practiced in the mirror. She had already drafted a heartfelt, poignant social media post about honoring her father's legacy, complete with a carefully selected, artfully filtered photo of the two of them from a charity gala years ago. She was not here to grieve. She was here to gather the material for the next chapter of her online narrative, the grieving daughter, now a powerful heiress, navigating her loss with style and fortitude. Sam, as usual, seemed to be in a different room altogether. He sat slightly apart from his siblings, his gaze fixed on the intricate patterns of the wood grain on the table. He had not spoken a word to Audrey since the disastrous meeting at her house, but his eyes, when they briefly met hers, were a swirling vortex of shame and anxiety. He was a man caught in a riptide, too weak to swim for shore, and too frightened to let himself be pulled under. The door opened, and Robert Miller entered, his face a professional mask of solemnity. He was a tall man in his late 60s, with a mane of silver hair and eyes that had seen the best and worst of human nature. He nodded to each person in the room, his gaze lingering for a moment on Audrey, with a look of quiet encouragement. "Thank you all for coming," he began, his voice calm and measured as he took his place at the head of the table, placing a thick, blue-backed document before him. "I know this is a difficult time. The purpose of this meeting is to read the last will and testament of Richard A. Thompson, dated October 20th of last year." Audrey saw a flicker of something. Annoyance? Confusion? Crossed Leo's face at the mention of the date. He had clearly assumed the will would be the decades-old document that had promised him a kingdom. "Before we begin," Leo interrupted, his tone brisk and businesslike, "I want to make it clear that I, as my father's eldest son and a man of finance myself, am prepared to take on the responsibility of executing his wishes and managing the transition of his assets. I've already prepared a preliminary plan to ensure the stability of the company." Robert Miller held up a hand, a simple gesture that nonetheless carried the weight of absolute authority. "Your preparedness is noted, Leo. However, the will designates an executor. For now, let us proceed with the text. Your father was very specific about how he wanted this handled." Leo leaned back in his chair, a smug little smile playing on his lips. He was so certain of the outcome, so blinded by his own sense of destiny, that he couldn't see the abyss opening up at his feet. Miller cleared his throat and began to read. He started with the standard legal recitations, the declarations of sound mind and body, the revocation of all previous wills. And then he arrived at the bequests. "Equo hedecheodation bulamus of sar." "To my son, Leo Thompson," Miller read, his voice clear and unwavering, "I leave my collection of antique maps and the sum of $100,000. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the sound of Leo's sharp, incredulous intake of breath. He stared at Robert Miller as if the lawyer had suddenly started speaking in a foreign language. His own lawyer stopped fiddling with his phone and looked up, his brow furrowed. "I'm sorry," Leo said, his voice a choked whisper. "There must be a mistake. Did you say 100,000? "The figure is correct," Miller replied, his expression impassive. He then read Richard's accompanying words, his quote, fervent hope that the money would provide a fresh start, and that the maps would remind Leo of a world beyond the balance sheet. Each word was a perfectly aimed dart, puncturing Leo's inflated sense of self-worth. Before Leo could fully process the assault, Miller moved on. "To my daughter, Chloe Thompson Wells, I leave my late wife Eleanor's jewelry collection and the sum of $100,000. Chloe's carefully constructed mask of somber grace shattered. "What?" she gasped, her voice shrill. That's an insult. The jewelry is already mine. It was always meant to be mine. And $100,000? That wouldn't even cover the property taxes on my house for 2 years." Miller continued, his voice relentless, as he read Richard's hope that the jewelry would remind her of a woman of substance, and that the money would teach her the difference between need and want. It was a paternal rebuke from beyond the grave, a moral lesson delivered with the cold, hard precision of a legal document. Then came Sam's turn. "To my son, Samuel Thompson, I leave my personal library of first edition history books and the sum of $100,000. Sam's reaction was different. He didn't erupt in anger or disbelief. Instead, he simply slumped further in his chair, a look of profound, weary resignation on his face. He had expected to be a disappointment, and his father, in his final act, had confirmed it, lumping him in with the siblings he so despised. The books, a collection he truly did love, felt less like a gift and more like a consolation prize, for a life lived on the sidelines. The room throbbed with a volatile mixture of shock and fury. It was Leo who finally found his voice, his face a mottled, unhealthy red. "This is a joke. This is a sick, twisted joke. Where is the rest of it? The estate is worth tens of millions. The business, the houses, the portfolio, what happens to all of that?" Robert Miller turned the page of the will, his movements slow and deliberate. He looked directly at Leo, but his words were for the entire room. "Article 5, Residuary Estate," he read, his voice resonating with the finality of a judge's gavel. "All the rest, residue, and remainder of my estate, of every kind and nature, whether real, personal, or mixed, and wherever situated, I give, devise, and bequeath to my beloved wife, Audrey Thompson." If the previous bequests had been bombshells, this was a nuclear detonation. For a moment, there was only a stunned, echoing silence. Then, chaos erupted. Leo shot to his feet, his chair scraping violently against the floor. "No, that's impossible. She manipulated him. She coerced him. He was an old man. He wasn't in his right mind. This is a fraud." His lawyer, now fully engaged, put a restraining hand on his arm. "Leo, calm down." "Calm down?" Leo shrieked, his voice cracking. "She has stolen my birthright! Our birthright!" Chloe was openly sobbing, not with grief, but with rage. Her perfectly applied makeup was beginning to run, creating grotesque, dark rivers down her cheeks. She planned this. All those years, pretending to be so sweet, so helpful. She was just a parasite, waiting for him to die. How could he do this to us? To his own children? Amidst the storm of their fury, Audrey remained silent, her hands folded calmly on the table. She looked at their contorted faces, at the raw, ugly greed that had been stripped bare of all its social niceties, and she felt nothing. No pity, no triumph. Just a profound, hollow emptiness. This was who they were. This was what Richard had seen. Robert Miller cleared his throat, his voice cutting through the hysteria like a scalpel. "I would advise you all to compose yourselves. Your father was of perfectly sound mind and body when he executed this will. In fact, anticipating a challenge, he underwent a full physical and psychiatric evaluation the day before he signed it, the results of which are on file and confirm his complete mental competency. This new piece of information hit them like a physical blow. Their primary line of attack, that Audrey had manipulated a senile old man, had been preemptively destroyed. Richard, the master strategist, had outmaneuvered them one last time. Furthermore, Miller continued, his gaze cold and hard, your father left a letter of explanation. He was very specific that it was to be read aloud at this meeting, so that his reasoning would be understood by all. "No!" Chloe wailed. "I don't want to hear it. It's all lies she put in his head." "The reading of the letter is not optional," Miller stated flatly. "It is a directive of the will." He picked up the final sheet of paper, a copy of the letter Audrey already knew by heart. And in the dead, silent room, he began to read Richard's final, devastating message to his children. He read of Richard's disappointment in Leo's entitlement and his dismissal of Audrey. He read of his pain at Chloe's talent for exclusion and her casual cruelty. He read of his sadness at Sam's complicity and his failure to stand for what was right. With every word, the children seemed to shrink, their rage momentarily eclipsed by the stark, undeniable truth of their father's perception of them. And then came the part about Audrey. Olivia, in contrast, Miller read, his voice softening almost imperceptibly, has spent 15 years showing you nothing but kindness, patience, and genuine care. I am leaving my estate to Olivia because she has earned it. This is not a punishment. It is a recognition of worth. When he finished, the silence that descended was heavier, more profound than before. It was the silence of utter, absolute defeat. The legal maneuvering, the social media campaigns they had likely been planning, it had all been rendered moot. Their father hadn't just disinherited them financially, he had disinherited them morally. He had held up a mirror to their souls, and the reflection was hideous. For the first time since the reading began, Audrey spoke. Her voice was not gloating, not angry, not even triumphant. It was simply tired. "He tried to love you," she said. looking at each of them in turn. He tried so hard, for so long, to believe that you would become the people he raised you to be. But in the end, you broke his heart. Leo's lawyer, finally seeing the futility of the situation, began to pack his briefcase. "We will, of course, be contesting," he said, but the words lacked any conviction. It was a pro forma statement, the last gasp of a battle that had been lost before it even began. Leo, his face pale and drawn, gave Audrey a look of pure, unadulterated hatred. "This isn't over," he hissed. "Oh, I think it is," Audrey replied, rising from her chair. She walked over to the window, looking out over the manicured lawns of the office park. "Your father has had his final say. The rest is just noise." They filed out of the room, a defeated army in retreat. Leo, bristling with impotent rage. Chloe, a mess of mascara and shattered illusions. And Sam, his head bowed, looking like the loneliest man in the world. When they were gone, Robert Miller came and stood beside Audrey. "He was a good man," the lawyer said quietly, "and he loved you more than anything." "I know," Audrey said, a single perfect tear tracing a path down her cheek. She was no longer just Audrey Thompson, the grieving widow. She was Audrey Thompson, the sole heir to the Thompson fortune, the guardian of Richard's legacy, and the woman who now had to decide what to do with the power he had placed in her hands. The war, she suspected, was far from over. But the first, most important battle had been won. Nabateki and Tacker, the drive home from the lawyer's office was surreal. The familiar streets of Northwood, with their manicured lawns and stately homes, seemed unchanged, yet for Audrey the entire world had tilted on its axis. She was the sole inheritor of a fortune, the designated guardian of a legacy, and the target of her stepchildren's boundless rage. The weight of it was immense, a strange cocktail of empowerment and profound loneliness. She walked into the house on Maple Drive, the silence rushing to meet her. But it was a different silence now. It wasn't the silence of grief. It was the quiet of a fortress, a bastion that Richard had built for her. She ran her hand along the cool marble of the entryway table, no longer feeling like a guest in her own home, but its rightful chatelaine. The first volley in the inevitable war came less than an hour later. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. The message was blunt, brutal, and pulsing with Leo's impotent fury. "You think you've won? This is just the beginning. We'll see you in court. We'll see you in hell." Audrey deleted the message without a reply. Engaging would be like wrestling with a pig in mud. She would only get dirty, and the pig would enjoy it. Chloe's attack was more insidious, more public. By evening, the carefully curated narrative she had been crafting went live. She posted a photo of a younger Richard, smiling, with his 3 children gathered around him. The caption was a masterpiece of passive-aggressive martyrdom. "Sometimes the people we love are led astray in their final days. My heart is broken not by a will, but by the manipulation of a great man in his time of vulnerability. We will fight, not for money, but for my father's true legacy, the one of family, loyalty, and love. Please keep us in your thoughts as we seek justice for him. #family over everything, #justice for Richard." The post was a work of artful deception. It painted Audrey as a predator, and them as grieving children fighting to protect their father's honor. Within an hour, it was flooded with comments from Chloe's followers and a host of friends who barely knew the family. Messages of support poured in, condemning the unnamed opportunist who had taken advantage of a beloved patriarch. Lansing's online community had its villain, and its name was Audrey Thompson. Clara called, her voice fizzing with indignation. "Have you seen it? The gall of that woman! She's playing the victim while sitting in a mansion her father paid for. Don't you dare read the comments." "I won't," Audrey promised, though the temptation was a bitter itch. Let them have their circus. It's all they have left. The days that followed were a siege. The phone rang with calls from reporters from local papers, intrigued by the story of a local dynasty's implosion. Flowers arrived, not of condolence, but of pity, from society acquaintances who had chosen their side. It was a coordinated campaign of isolation, designed to paint Audrey as a pariah, a gold-digging widow who had conned her way into a fortune. Through it all, Audrey drew strength from Richard's letter. His words were her shield. "You are my legacy. Do not let them burden you with their bitterness." He had known this would happen. He had prepared her. One evening, staring out at the rose garden she and Richard had tended together, she felt a shift. The initial shock was wearing off, replaced by a steely resolve. They wanted a war, they would get one, but she would not fight it on their terms. With social media screeds and public histrionics, she would fight it as Richard would have, with quiet strength, strategic thinking, and the unassailable power of the truth. She was the keeper of his fortress, and she would not let it fall. The first crack in Leo and Chloe's meticulously constructed narrative appeared from the most unexpected of quarters, the Lansing Country Club, the very heart of the social sphere they sought to dominate. Margaret Sterling, the formidable 80-year-old matriarch of the club and a contemporary of Richard's, had cornered Chloe near the tennis courts. As the story was later recounted to Audrey by a gleeful Clara, Margaret had listened patiently to Chloe's tearful tale of elder abuse and manipulation before fixing her with an icy stare. "My dear," Margaret had said, her voice carrying across the perfectly manicured lawn, "I knew your father for 50 years. The only person who could ever manipulate Richard Thompson was Richard Thompson. And I've known Audrey since she arrived in this town. The only thing she is guilty of is loving your father and putting up with his ill-mannered children for 20 years. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a tea time." The public rebuke, delivered with the precision of a surgeon, sent a shockwave through their social circle. People began to talk. They remembered Audrey's quiet grace at countless charity events. They recalled her tireless, uncredited work on committees. They thought about the genuine warmth she had always shown, a stark contrast to Chloe's performative charm and Leo's abrasive ambition. The next blow to their campaign came from the pulpit. Reverend Michael, the gentle, thoughtful head of the local Presbyterian church that Richard and Audrey had attended, delivered a sermon on the nature of legacy. Without naming names, he spoke of a man who built a great enterprise but knew that his true legacy was not in brick and mortar, but in the love and kindness he inspired. He spoke of how true family is not always a matter of blood, but of choice, of showing up, of caring. The entire congregation knew who he was talking about. Then Sam reappeared. He arrived on Audrey's doorstep one rainy afternoon, looking thinner, older, and utterly broken. He stood on the porch, drenched and defeated. "I can't do it anymore, Audrey," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "They want me to sign affidavits. They want me to lie, to say Dad was confused, that you controlled him. I can't." Audrey looked at the man before her, the son who had been her greatest disappointment, because he had been her greatest hope. She saw not just a coward, but a man in agony. She stepped aside and opened the door. "Come in, Sam, get out of the rain." Inside, he confessed everything. He told her of the pressure from Leo, the emotional blackmail from Chloe, the meetings with lawyers who were trying to build a case out of lies and innuendo. "Dad's letter," he choked out, tears streaming down his face. "He was right. About everything. About me. I watched them treat you like dirt for years, and I did nothing. My silence was a weapon they used against you. I am so sorry." It was the apology she had waited 20 years to hear. It was not a cure, but it was a beginning. "What do you want to do now, Sam?" she asked gently. "I want to tell the truth," he said, looking her in the eye for the first time. "Whatever it costs." The cost, he would soon learn, was the complete and total severance from his siblings. But in losing them, Sam began the long, slow process of finding himself. His decision to break ranks was more than just a personal victory, it was a public declaration. The united front of the Poyants. Thompson children was broken, and Audrey's fortress had just gained its first, most unlikely, defender. Armed with Sam's defection and a renewed sense of purpose, Audrey made her next move. The battle for public opinion was turning, but the true seat of power, the heart of the empire Richard had built, was Thompson Financial. Leo was still acting as if he ran the place, issuing directives and unnerving employees with talk of aggressive restructuring. It was time to formally claim her throne. On Monday morning, Audrey walked into the gleaming downtown lobby of Thompson Financial. She had never felt more out of her element, yet never more certain of her purpose. She bypassed the reception desk and took the elevator directly to the executive floor. The hushed, carpeted corridor was lined with portraits of Lansing's founding fathers, all stern-faced men. Audrey smiled faintly. They were about to get some new company. She walked directly into Richard's office, her office now. It was a large corner suite with panoramic views of the city. Leo was inside, sitting behind Richard's desk, on the phone, barking orders. He looked up as she entered, his face contorting into a mask of rage. "What do you think you're doing?" he snarled, slamming the phone down. "This is a private office." "Yes, it is," Audrey said, her voice calm and cool. She placed her handbag on the corner of the polished mahogany desk. "It's mine." She walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows, turning her back on him to look out at the city. "I've just come from a meeting with the board, Leo. They have been informed of the contents of the will and my position as the sole owner and chairwoman. Your authority here was a temporary illusion. That illusion is now over." "The board?" he sputtered. "You can't." "I can," she interrupted, turning to face him. Her gaze was like steel. "I have. Your company keycard has been deactivated. Security will escort you from the building. Your personal effects will be boxed up and sent to you." Leo stared at her, his mouth agape. He looked like a fish gasping for air. The sheer audacity, the speed of her maneuver, had left him utterly wrong-footed. "You're an art history major," he finally managed to say, his voice dripping with contempt. "You know nothing about finance. You'll run this company into the ground." "You're wrong," Audrey said. "I know everything about Richard's philosophy. He believed in stability, in integrity, and in treating his employees like family, not assets to be stripped. Your plan to, quote, aggressively restructure and fire half the staff to boost short-term profits is a betrayal of everything he stood for. That won't be happening." As if on cue, 2 uniformed security guards appeared at the office door. Leo looked from them to Audrey, the reality of his situation finally crashing down on him. He had been comprehensively and humiliatingly dethroned. Without another word, he grabbed his briefcase and stormed out of the office, brushing past the guards in a fury of impotent rage. Audrey stood alone in the magnificent office. The quiet that descended was the sound of victory. She had cut off the head of the snake. Later that day, she called an all-staff meeting. Standing before the men and women who had worked for Richard for decades, she didn't pretend to be a financial wizard. Instead, she spoke of her commitment to honoring Richard's legacy of stability and integrity. She announced that the profit-sharing program would remain, and that there would be no layoffs. The relief in the room was palpable. It was a quiet coup, but a decisive one. She wasn't just the owner in name, she was the leader in spirit. The final act of the drama played out not in a courtroom or an office, but at the Lansing Historical Society's annual fundraising gala, the premier social event of the year. Audrey had initially planned not to attend, but Clara had insisted. "You cannot let them make you a recluse," she'd argued. "You are the head of this community now. You need to show up." So Audrey went, dressed in a stunning silver gown, looking not like a grieving widow, but a queen. The atmosphere in the grand ballroom was electric. Everyone knew the story. Whispers followed her as she moved through the room, but they were no longer whispers of condemnation. They were whispers of awe. Chloe was there, of course, holding court in a corner, surrounded by a dwindling circle of allies. She tried to ignore Audrey's presence, but it was impossible. Audrey was the center of gravity in the room. The turning point came during the live auction. The final item was the naming rights to a new wing of the museum. The bidding was fierce, but when it stalled at $90,000, a new voice, clear and steady, entered the fray. $100,000, Audrey said from her table. A hush fell over the room. Leo and Chloe stared at her, their faces a mixture of shock and fury. Audrey was using their money, or what they still considered their money, to cement her status as the town's leading philanthropist. But she wasn't done. She stood up, a vision of elegance and power. "And I would like to make an additional pledge," she announced, her voice ringing through the silent hall. "In honor of my late husband, Richard Thompson, a man who loved this city and believed in its future, I am establishing the Thompson Family Foundation with an initial endowment of $5 million, dedicated to supporting education, arts, and community development here in Lansing." The room erupted in applause. It was a stunning, strategic, and deeply generous act. She had taken the wealth they coveted and transformed it into a public good, forever linking the cause. Thompson's name not with their petty squabbles, but with her own vision and generosity. She wasn't just spending the money. She was laundering the family legacy, cleansing it of their greed. Chloe looked as if she had been slapped. This was a public relations masterstroke she could never hope to counter. Defeated, she and her husband made a hasty exit from the gala, her social reign in Lansing officially over. Later that evening, as Audrey accepted congratulations from the mayor, she saw Sam across the room. He was standing alone, watching her. He raised his glass in a quiet toast, a look of profound, respectful admiration in his eyes. It was a silent acknowledgement. Their father had chosen wisely. The legacy was in the right hands. The final confrontation did not happen across a boardroom table or in a lawyer's office. It happened where the story had truly begun, in the rose garden behind the house on Maple Drive. It was a beautiful spring day, nearly a year after Richard's death. Audrey was pruning the peace roses, the first variety she and Richard had planted together, when she heard them approach. Leo and Chloe stood at the edge of the flagstone patio, their faces pale and etched with the bitterness of a long-lost war. Their legal challenges had been summarily dismissed by the courts. Their social standing was in tatters. They looked diminished, stripped of the arrogance that had been their armor. They had come, not with lawyers, but with one last, desperate appeal. "What do you want?" Audrey asked, not unkindly. She set down her pruning shears, wiping her hands on her gardening apron. "This is absurd, Audrey," Leo began, his voice lacking its usual bluster. "You've made your point. You've humiliated us, you've taken everything. Isn't it enough? We are still his children. We're willing to negotiate," Chloe added, the word tasting like poison in her mouth. "A settlement, for the good of the family name. We'll stop the legal challenges if you provide us with a significant portion of the estate. It's the right thing to do." Audrey looked at them, truly looked at them, and felt a profound sense of pity. Even now, after everything, they still didn't understand. They thought this was a transaction, a negotiation. They still believed they were owed something. "There is nothing to negotiate," Audrey said, her voice soft but firm. "This was never about the money for me. And it was never just about the money for your father. It was about character." She walked over to a small stone bench nestled among the blooms. "He sat here, you know, on his last good day. We talked about this garden. He said you can't just expect roses to bloom, AUD. You have to nurture them. You have to feed them, prune the deadwood, protect them from blight. It's work. Love is work." She looked up at them, her gaze clear and unwavering. "He gave you everything. The best soil, the brightest sun. He nurtured you for decades. But you became the blight. You took, and you took, and you never once offered anything in return. Not gratitude, not respect, not even simple kindness." "We loved him," Chloe insisted, tears of frustration welling in her eyes. "Did you?" Audrey countered. "Or did you love what he could do for you? When was the last time you asked him about his life, his happiness? Or did you just come to him with a list of your needs? He told me, near the end, That he felt like a walking, talking ATM, his own children, and he felt like a bank. The truth of her words hung in the air, undeniable and devastating. "He left you what he thought you had earned," Audrey continued. "A chance to start over. A chance to learn the lessons he failed to teach you. The lesson that a legacy isn't an inheritance you receive, but a life you live. What you do with that chance is up to you. But the Thompson legacy, his true legacy of integrity, generosity, and kindness, that was left in my care, and I will not allow you to poison it." She stood up and picked up her shears again, turning back to her roses. The gesture was a clear dismissal. The conversation was over. For them, it had always been about a final transaction. For her, it was about continuing a life's work. Leo and Chloe stood there for a long moment, speechless. They had come for a fight, for a negotiation, for one last chance to claim what they believed was theirs. Instead, they had received a final, quiet lesson from the woman they had so profoundly underestimated. There was nothing more to say. Defeated, not by legal strategy or financial power, but by the simple, unassailable truth, they turned and walked away, leaving Audrey alone in the quiet beauty of the garden her husband had loved. 1 year later, the house on Maple Drive was no longer silent. It was filled with the sounds of life. On a sun-drenched Saturday afternoon, the sprawling back lawn hosted the first-ever meeting of the Thompson Family Foundation scholarship recipients. Dozens of bright, ambitious students from Lansing, their futures made possible by a gift they would never have expected. Audrey, at 73, moved among them with a radiant energy. She had found her true calling not as a society wife or even a corporate chairwoman, but as a philanthropist. She ran the foundation with the same meticulous care she gave her roses, ensuring that Richard's wealth was a seed that would bear fruit for generations. Thompson Financial, now managed by a trusted successor who shared Richard's values, was more successful than ever, its profits fueling the foundation's work. Sam was there, a new confidence in his posture. He was on the foundation's board of directors, his insights as an educator proving invaluable. He had used his modest inheritance to take a sabbatical, travel, and write a history book, a lifelong dream. He and his wife had become the closest thing to family Audrey had left, their children filling the great house with laughter during frequent visits. He had found his peace, not in wealth, but in purpose. As for Leo and Chloe, their lives had unraveled. Leo's venture capital firm, without the constant infusion of his father's money to mask its flaws, had collapsed. He'd had to sell his mansion and was now living in a modest townhouse, a man haunted by the ghost of a future he had felt was his by right. Chloe's social media empire had crumbled. Her narrative of victimhood had grown stale, and her followers had moved on. Without an endless stream of money to fund her lavish lifestyle, her brand of effortless elegance became an impossible charade. She had divorced her husband and was reportedly living a quiet, much-reduced life, a queen without a kingdom. They were not destitute, but they were living with the consequences Richard had intended, lives built on the scale of what they could earn themselves, not what they were owed. Standing on the terrace, watching a young woman who wanted to be a doctor animatedly describe her plans, Audrey felt a profound sense of rightness. Clara stood beside her, sipping iced tea. "He would be so proud, you know," Clara said quietly. Audrey smiled, her eyes scanning the crowd of hopeful young faces. "He didn't leave me his money," she said, her voice filled with a wisdom earned through fire. "He left me his work. And it's only just beginning." The inheritance that was meant to be the end of a story had become the beginning of 100 new ones. It was a legacy not of gold, but of grace. In the end, Audrey had learned, that was the only kind that truly bloomed. 2 years after the reading of the will, the house on Maple Drive was unrecognizable from the silent, grief-stricken mausoleum it had once been. The grand rooms, once heavy with tension, now echoed with the chaotic joy of Lego constructions and the distant sounds of a piano being played slightly off-key. Sam's 2 children, 8-year-old Lily and 10-year-old Ben, had claimed the house as their weekend paradise, and Audrey had discovered a talent for being a grandmother she never knew she possessed. She was no longer just the keeper of Richard's legacy, she was the matriarch of a new one, a family built not on obligation or blood, but on conscious choice and mutual respect. Sam and his wife Emma had become her staunchest allies and dearest friends. They had dinner together every Sunday, a ritual that healed the wounds of all the strained, performative family meals of the past. During one of these dinners, Sam, looking more relaxed and content than Audrey had ever seen him, shared some news. The history book he had written during his sabbatical had been picked up by a university press. "It's not going to be a bestseller," he said with a laugh, "but it's mine. Something I did entirely on my own." He looked across the table at Audrey, his eyes filled with a quiet gratitude that went beyond words. "Dad left me the books, and you gave me the time. It's the best gift I've ever received." Audrey's role at Thompson Financial had also evolved. After stabilizing the company and installing a competent, trusted CEO who shared her and Richard's values, she had stepped back from the day-to-day operations. She remained the chairwoman of the board, her presence a guiding moral compass. But she poured most of her energy into the Thompson Family Foundation. It had become one of the most significant charitable forces in the state, transforming communities with its support for arts, education, and healthcare initiatives. She had taken the wealth that could have been a source of endless strife and turned it into a wellspring of hope. One afternoon, while reviewing scholarship applications, she came across an essay from a young woman who wanted to be a social worker. The applicant wrote, "My father has worked at Thompson Financial for 30 years. He always said Mr. Thompson built a company that felt like a family. Now with the foundation, it feels like his family is taking care of all of ours." Reading those words, Audrey felt Richard's presence so strongly it was as if he were standing behind her, a hand on her shoulder. This was his true legacy. Not the stock portfolio or the real estate holdings, but the continuation of his core belief that wealth was a responsibility, and its ultimate purpose was to lift others up. The children of his blood had failed to grasp this, but the children of his employees, the children of his community, understood it perfectly. She approved the scholarship, her pen stroke firm and decisive, another small act in the quiet, ongoing work of honoring a good man's life. Audrey rarely thought of Leo and Chloe anymore. They were like ghosts from a past life. Their anger and bitterness faded into the background of her busy, fulfilling present. But sometimes, the past would send a faint echo into the present. It happened one day when she was having lunch with Clara at a downtown cafe. Clara was scrolling through the local news on her phone when she suddenly stopped. "Oh my," she murmured. "What is it?" Audrey asked. Clara turned the phone around. The headline read, "Local financier Leo Thompson faces bankruptcy, sued by investors for fraud." The article detailed the spectacular collapse of Leo's firm, revealing a pattern of reckless bets and misrepresented returns. He had tried to replicate his father's success without an ounce of his father's prudence or integrity. The modest inheritance that was meant to be a fresh start had been incinerated in his desperate attempt to prove he didn't need his father's fortune to be a big shot. Now, he was losing everything, including his reputation. Audrey felt a pang, not of satisfaction, but of a deep, sorrowful pity. Richard had seen this flaw in him, the arrogance, the desperate need for validation, and had tried in his own way to save him from it. But Leo had been determined to self-destruct. A few weeks later, Audrey saw Chloe in the flesh for the first time in years. Audrey was leaving a matinee at the local theater when she saw her stepdaughter across the street, pushing a shopping cart out of a discount grocery store. The designer clothes were gone, replaced by worn jeans and a faded sweatshirt. The confident, imperious air had vanished, leaving behind a woman who looked tired, anonymous, and profoundly unhappy. Their eyes met for a fleeting second across the busy street. There was no anger in Chloe's gaze, only a hollow sort of recognition, before she quickly looked away and pushed her cart toward a modest, decade-old sedan. In that brief, silent exchange, Audrey saw the full arc of Chloe's story. Her identity had been so tied to wealth and social status that without them, she had simply ceased to be the person she had pretended to be. The inheritance hadn't just been money to her. It had been her entire sense of self. Walking to her car, Audrey didn't feel victorious. She felt a quiet confirmation of Richard's wisdom. He hadn't just protected her, he had tried to give his children a lesson in authenticity, a chance to build lives of real substance. He had given them the one thing they had never had, the opportunity to fail, and perhaps to learn who they really were when the money was gone. Leo and Chloe were living out the final, painful lessons of their father's will, a curriculum of consequences designed by a man who had loved them enough to tell them the truth, even if it was from beyond the grave. 5 years to the day after Richard's death, the grounds of the Lansing Botanical Gardens were alive with a joyful energy that felt like the man himself. The Thompson Family Foundation was celebrating its 5th anniversary by dedicating a new children's garden, a project Audrey had personally overseen. It was a whimsical paradise of interactive fountains, sensory plants, and winding paths designed to spark curiosity and wonder. Audrey, now 77, watched from a bench as children from all over the city explored the space with uninhibited delight. Her hair was completely silver now, but her eyes, the same blue Richard had fallen in love with, were bright with a deep, settled peace. She was no longer just the inheritor of a fortune. She was a creator of joy, a cultivator of community. Sam stood beside her, his arm gently resting on her shoulder. At 47, the anxiety that had once shadowed his features was gone, replaced by a quiet, steady confidence. His history book had become required reading in several university courses, and he had discovered a passion for teaching at the college level. He was a man who had finally grown into himself. He would have loved this, Sam said, his voice thick with emotion. More than any skyscraper or corporate merger, this is real. This is his legacy, Sam, Audrey replied softly. It's not in a vault. It's here. Just then, Sam's daughter Lily, now a bright 13-year-old, ran up to them, her face flushed with excitement. In her hands she held a freshly potted marigold. "Grandma Audrey, look," she said, her voice filled with pride. "They let us plant our own to take home. I picked this one for you, to put in your garden next to Grandpa Richard's roses." Audrey took the small pot, her heart swelling with a love so profound it almost hurt. She looked at this wonderful girl, a girl who saw her not as a step-grandmother or the source of a trust fund, but simply as her grandmother, a girl who, without any prompting, understood the connection between a new flower and an old love. In that moment, the entire painful saga of the will, the betrayal and the fight, seemed like a distant storm that had passed long ago, leaving the air clean and the ground fertile for new growth. The inheritance wasn't the money, the house, or the company. The true inheritance was this: a sunny afternoon, a child's simple gift, and a family that had been pruned of its deadwood and allowed to bloom in the most unexpected and beautiful of ways. Later that evening, as the sun began to set, casting long golden shadows across the gardens, Audrey stood alone by a small plaque at the entrance to the children's garden. It read, "The Richard and Audrey Thompson Children's Garden, for the children of Lansing, who remind us that the best things in life are meant to be shared." She traced his name with her finger. The ache of his absence would never fully disappear, but it had been softened by the warmth of a life filled with purpose, and a family forged in love. Leo and Chloe were distant memories, cautionary tales she no longer dwelled on. Their choices were their own. Her choice had been to build, to nurture, to love. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves, and Audrey smiled. She had honored the man who had chosen her, who had trusted her with everything he had and everything he was. She had taken his final gift and made it grow. The war was long over, and in its place a garden had flourished. And that, she knew, was a legacy that would last forever. 7 years after Richard's death, Audrey sat in the sun-drenched library of her home, a place that now felt entirely her own. At 79, she moved with a slower, more deliberate grace, but her mind remained as sharp as ever. The Thompson Foundation had become a beacon of hope in the region, and her life was full, surrounded by the laughter of Sam's family and the deep satisfaction of meaningful work. The bitter conflict that had defined the start of her widowhood had faded into a distant, almost unbelievable memory. Then, a letter arrived. It was postmarked from a small, unfamiliar town a few states away. The handwriting on the envelope was hesitant, almost childish, but Audrey recognized it instantly. It was from Chloe. Her first instinct was to throw it away, to not allow any shadow from that past to fall upon her peaceful present. But a deeper curiosity, a sense of needing to close the final chapter, stayed her hand. With a steady breath, she opened it. The letter inside was not the screed of rage or the entitled demand she might once have expected. The words that filled the single, tear-stained page were broken, stripped of all artifice. Audrey, I don't know why I'm writing this. I don't expect you to read it, and I know I don't deserve a reply. For years, I have wanted to hate you. It was easier than hating myself. But the truth is, you did nothing wrong. You loved my father, and he loved you, and we were cruel to you because of it. We were spoiled and blind, and so full of ourselves we couldn't see the good right in front of us. I am not writing to ask for money for myself. I live a small life now. I work at a diner. It's honest work, and I am learning, slowly, what it means to earn something. But my son, Jason, has fallen ill. The medical bills are overwhelming, and I see the fear in his eyes. He is an innocent in all of this. He is the one good thing I have managed not to ruin. Kalatai, I am not asking you to rescue me. I am only asking if you can find it in your heart to help him. Whatever you decide, I want you to know this. Dad was right. About all of it. I am sorry. I am so deeply sorry for the pain I caused you and the disappointment I caused him. Chloe. Audrey read the letter twice, her heart aching with a complex mix of emotions. The raw, unvarnished honesty was something she had never thought Chloe capable of. This wasn't a manipulation. It was a plea from a desperate mother who had finally, painfully, hit rock bottom. She discussed the letter with Sam. He read it, his face etched with a familiar sorrow. She's finally telling the truth, he said quietly. It took losing everything for her to find it. Audrey's decision came quickly, instinctively. It was not a question of forgiveness. That was a long, complicated road. It was a question of compassion. Richard had built his fortune to provide security and opportunity. Chloe had squandered hers, but her son, Jason, was an innocent. He was Richard's grandson. She did not write Chloe back. She did not send a personal check. Instead, she acted through the foundation. An anonymous grant was made to the hospital where Jason was being treated, covering his medical expenses in full. A separate, modest educational trust was established in Jason's name, to be managed by a third party, ensuring he would have the chance for a future his mother could no longer provide. It was an act of quiet, unseen grace. It was not about reconciliation with Chloe, but about responsibility to the next generation. It was about honoring the grandfather, not rewarding the daughter. A few weeks later, a small, unsigned note arrived at the foundation's office. It contained only 2 words, "Thank you." Audrey knew who it was from. Sitting in her library, the late afternoon sun streaming through the windows, she felt a final, profound sense of peace settle over her. She had fought the war and won. She had built a new legacy from the ashes of the old. And in the end, she had chosen not vengeance but mercy, not for Chloe's sake but for her own. It was the final, definitive act of a woman who had inherited a fortune, but whose true wealth was found in a grace her stepchildren were only just beginning to comprehend. The story was, at last, complete. A decade has passed since Richard left the world. From her vantage point at 82, Audrey sees time not as a linear path, but as the concentric rings of a great old tree. Each ring holds a season of struggle, of growth, of quiet victory. The raw, searing grief of that first year has softened into a sweet, enduring warmth, like the last rays of a summer sun. The war is a distant memory, a story she sometimes tells Clara, and they marvel at the women they were then. The fury, the strategy, the courtroom battles, it all seems to have happened to someone else. The house on Maple Drive is quieter now. Sam's children are away at college, their tuition paid for by the grandfather they knew through stories and the foundation that bore his name. But they return often, bringing with them a new generation of friends who fill the halls with life, ensuring the silence is never lonely. Sam is now the head of the history department at the local university, a respected academic whose quiet integrity is his most notable feature. He speaks of his father often, not with the pained shame of the past, but with a deep, learned understanding. He is living proof that a legacy of character can be inherited, even if it skips a generation. Of Leo, little is heard. The financial ruin was total. He lives in obscurity, a ghost of the titan he thought he was destined to be. His story became a quiet, cautionary tale whispered at the country club. A man who inherited his father's ambition but none of his substance. And Chloe, in a strange and quiet way, found a different kind of peace. After Audrey's anonymous gift saved her son, she never reached out again. But years later, Audrey received a clipping from a small-town newspaper, sent by an anonymous source. It was a short feature on local volunteers. There was a picture of Chloe, older, plainer, smiling a genuine, unforced smile as she handed a tray of food to someone at a community soup kitchen. The caption quoted her as saying, "You find out who you are when you have nothing left to prove." Perhaps Richard's final lesson had, after all these years, finally been learned. Audrey spends most of her days in the garden now. It has expanded, become more wild and beautiful over the years. The Thompson Foundation is a self-sustaining entity, run by a board that embodies the values she and Richard championed. Her work is done. Today, she walks through the rose garden, her hand brushing against the velvety petals of the peace rose. She thinks about inheritance. She once thought it was the house, the stocks, the tangible assets. But she knows now that was never it. The real inheritance was the quiet courage Richard had instilled in her. It was the loyalty of a friend like Clara. It was the redemption of a man like Sam. It was the opportunity to turn wealth into wellness, money into meaning. She looks at her hands, wrinkled and spotted with age, the hands that pruned roses, signed million-dollar checks, and held the hands of children who called her grandma. They are the hands of a gardener, one who was given a magnificent, overgrown and weed-choked garden, and was trusted to care for it. She had to pull the weeds, even when it was painful. She had to nurture the struggling blooms. And she had to plant new seeds, seeds of kindness and opportunity, that would flourish long after she was gone. A breeze stirs the leaves, a familiar whisper. The story is over. The legacy, she knows, is in the hands of the future, in the lives of the students, the health of the community, the character of her chosen family. The gardener's work is never truly finished, but she can rest now, content in the quiet shade of the beautiful, thriving garden she helped to grow.